Hi,
What?
everyone. Welcome back. It's Naomi Wolf with Outspoken and Daily Clout. And if you're watching, we're on Substack Live. And I'm back with one of my favorite guests, favorite people, favorite radical philosophers, and that is Josh Stylman. Welcome back, Josh.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is our honor. Josh Stylman has been an entrepreneur. Stop it. Sorry. And investor for 30 years. I can't believe you've been anything for 30 years. For 2 decades, he focused on building and growing companies in the digital economy, co-founding and successfully exiting 3 businesses while investing in and mentoring dozens of technology startups. In 2014, seeking to create a meaningful impact in his local community, Stylman founded Three's Brewing, a craft brewery and hospitality company that became a beloved Brooklyn institution. He served as CEO till 2022. Today, Stylman lives in the Hudson Valley with his wife and children, where he balances family life with various business ventures and community engagement. Welcome back. His bio has not been updated to say he's the trippiest Carlos Castaneda / I don't know, radical philosopher, Orwellian philosopher of reality, trippy, like you think it's a conspiracy theory, but then it turns out to be thoroughly documented and grounded essayist working, I would say, in America right now. I don't say that lightly. Every time I talk to him, like I dread and love talking to Josh, because literally I look in my phone, he'll send me some citation to a link that will blow my mind and change my construct of reality, timeline of history. I always want him to be wrong. He hasn't been yet. And so we're back with the 3rd and 4th part, summarizing from him his magisterial 4-part series on MK Ultra and the construction of reality. So in the last episode, which all of you followed and loved, Josh told us about Tavistock Institute, about the migration of culture producers from England to America, the mid-century construction in America of reality production, culture production in essence, and the manufacture of consensus. Please jump in and correct my summary, and then let's pick up with section 3.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's a ridiculous introduction, but thank you for the kind words. And the feeling is absolutely mutual. I'm a huge fan of you and the show. Your very formidable husband may or may not have told me to stop texting you at night because you get bad dreams from me. So I will be more careful and only email you during business.
You give me nightmares is the problem. I'm always like, oh my God.
I don't want to be right about any of this stuff. And I'm also very careful not to make claims when I can't make claims.
Correct. You never make claims.
Part of the gist of the whole series is really using my friend Mark Schiffer's pattern recognition manifesto, which I posted on my Substack, which essentially just talks about noticing patterns and connecting them, and maybe or maybe not inferring causality from them. At some point, when the patterns pile up, the probability that they're just a mere coincidence or serendipity becomes infinitesimal to 0. So I think it's important for anyone interested in this series or just this work broadly, think about things through that lens, and it really opens up, a whole host of possibilities. And I think as well, it's really important to consider the idea of just considering a possibility without actually believing it. Something I've really trained my brain to do, right? Because there's some really crazy shit. And, we've seen some really crazy shit in the last few years that is demonstrably true. And I think the idea is, once you consider the art of the possible, without going all in and hitching your whole, ideology or dogma to it, and I think that's part of the problem, that people do that too often, really opens up your entire aperture for what the world might be. And we've seen so much is a deception. I sort of go into everything with the possibility that everything kind of has to be a lie, or at least I may be wrong about everything, and I'm just trying to falsify things to try to get to the truth.
Mhm.
Last time, I guess we spent a lot of time, and shame on me, it wasn't nearly enough time to talk about the entirety of the series in an hour. We really focused, I think, just inherently on the first two parts, which were the laboratory, which is so. For those who missed the first part or haven't read the series, I have been studying mind control with some friends for a few years and decided to write down some of my notes and thought about telling it and came up with the best way through this 4-part allegory. So part one was the laboratory, which is really the origins of mind control and real experimentation with Nazis and then the United States government, and then the theater phase where celebrities essentially became programmable conduits, starting from the age of Marilyn Monroe all the way to present day. And then really phases 3 or chapters 3 and 4 are what I refer to as the network and the mirror. And the network is really about scaling through, kind of scaling through mass implementation. So techniques that were once confined to classified facilities now reach billions of us, often through these devices we carry every single day. And it operates, I argue, through three primary mechanisms. One are mass trauma events. We can talk about what some of those are that function as societal pattern interrupts. So they kind of hit us over the head, and we wake up in the morning expecting to go to work or take our kids to school or do whatever we have planned for that day, and something big happens. There've been a couple in each generation.
Right.
I talk about mass ritual programming, which you and I have talked about offline for the last couple of years. And those are really spectacles that synchronize our consciousness at scale. Think about like the Super Bowl halftime show, or most recently that spectacle at the Paris Olympics that seemed to be designed to outrage.
Mhm.
And then really we have these direct technological interfaces that I argue create handler-subject relationships. Whether that's the design or not is up to the beholder. But I believe these smartphones aren't just tools; they're relationships, and increasingly, I believe they're the most dominant relationship in most people's lives.
Yeah.
So I think what makes the network most effective is its invisibility. So really, it doesn't announce itself for control, but it really presents itself as convenience and connectivity. I mean, think about, how we use our phones every single day for every single thing. And, as the world is going digital and we've got Real ID on the forefront, these things are only becoming more and more pervasive and connected to our lives. And these smartphones are now tracking our emotional states through voice analysis. And I go through, and I won't bore with all the detail, but I've 100 or so patents of real technology with real companies like Microsoft and Apple and Facebook that are developing that really try to get into our brainwaves and predict our thoughts, control our thoughts, impact our thoughts. And I really think the sophistication, these systems went from coercion into consent. So it's really, the sort of Huxley model of, we've signed up for this through pleasure and through convenience. And, I talk about that a bit, so kind of what the MK Ultra researchers achieved through trauma, drugs, and electrodes.
And just recap for people who didn't see the first episode, what the MK Ultra program was and methodology.
The very notion, and there's a whole bunch on methodology, but the very notion is essentially getting into someone's thoughts and getting them to behave in a particular way or think a particular way without their consent. And there's a lot on this.
In the case of MK Ultra, this was a real program. I wanted it again.
Yes.
Those Josh Stylman things. I wanted it. It's something I dismissed forever and wanted to assign to the crazies. And then when you started to address it, I'm like, oh no, this must be real. But it is actually. I read Chaos over the weekend, the history of the CIA in the 60s. And it is a real program. And in fact, I had a surreal experience where I called my mom and said, did you know this person in the Hague, who turned out to have been CIA operatives doing mind control experiments on hippies in the Haight-Ashbury. And she's like, oh yeah, chubby, annoying guy. I knew him. I knew them. They were like around us, which was so creepy. But anyway, back to you and MK Ultra. Yes.
Yeah. So, these programs, in the old days, these things were really done with, trauma and drugs through things like the LSD clinic in the Haight, or electrodes, and the network
as the free clinic. It was beloved. We thought it was a free clinic run by hippies to give healthcare to the hippies, and it turns out to have been a total CIA brain control research front. But go ahead.
And I forget the exact connection, or whether Tom O'Neill, the author of Chaos, makes this, but there is speculation that is where the Charles Manson gang got their drugs, and certainly, the whole flower power movement, which I always thought was organic and kind of inspiring. But nonetheless, it does seem like the further you zoom out, the more of these nodes in the network kind of connect.
Yeah, can I jump in with there? I mean, I was a child in the hippie revolution in the Haight in the late 60s, early 70s, and then a young teenager in the 70s. And I was aware of the kind of phase of the hippie movement that was about pot and love and peace, and then that it kind of tipped over into speed and aggression and paranoia and craziness. Everyone was aware of that, but we thought it was organic. And now reading Chaos, I saw that first they tried the pot and the mushrooms, to see what that did to rats and humans. And then they did the mass dosing with speed. And I told my mom that, and she's like, oh my God, we both clicked. Like, this looked organic to us when we lived through it. It turns out to have been an experiment on a population. But please go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's wild, all of it. And then, like a lot of this sort of alternative research, the truth is straight crazier than fiction.
Right.
So in the piece, I argue that, the evolution is that what I call the network now operates through dopamine loops, algorithm-driven content delivery, and frequency manipulation.
So do you mean a neural network or like a community network, or both?
Both. And the word, I was being a little clever. The word is a double entendre. So it both is a neural node, but we are all connected. And I put one of these memes in the story. The meme with the guy holding the little hypnotizer, and whether it's the Ukraine flag or the Pride flag or BLM or whatever the issue du jour is. And I vividly remember, because I was on a much smaller scale than you have been consistently through your heroic effort, but I was canceled in my community for speaking against the vaccine mandates.
Pretty audible all over the pages of the New York Times. That's how I first found out about you.
For a private person who's not remotely a public figure who owns a small business, it was really weird. But that wasn't the point. The point was the mandates ended a couple of weeks after. And I remember sort of like everything was blowing up with me, and then they ended the mandates, and the Ukraine war was starting at the same exact time. And I remember all of these people that, it was sort of like, oh no, we don't hate the anti-vaxxers now. We hate the Russians. We must hate the Russians. And it was as if that, it was as if that, like, the chip went in their head. And I thought that was just a metaphor at that time. And now I'm realizing, I've studied, as a young man, I studied Edward Bernays and propaganda, and I really thought I understood it. And I guess, I knew a little bit about Operation Mockingbird, which revealed the CIA's.
Like when you say Edward Bernays or Operation Mockingbird, just a little ID for each.
Yeah. So Edward Bernays is generally regarded as the father of modern propaganda. He wrote a book literally called Propaganda. He helped kick off things like the early days of the feminist movement and getting women to smoke. He created the modern breakfast of cereal, and some of us know, and particularly those of us who closely follow the food health or the food freedom community, the food pyramids upside down, which is something I certainly didn't know as a child. We can thank Edward Bernays for that. Fun fact is he is the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and their great nephew, a guy named Mark Bernays Randolph is the founder of Netflix, which some might argue is a modern propaganda. So I knew a little bit about propaganda broadly. And I remember, and generally I've made fun of this. Sometimes I've been susceptible to it because we're all susceptible to it in our own way. Through this research, it's been demonstrated to me that there's something far more insidious than just mere propaganda. Okay. And I think for me, the recognition is that we're mimetic creatures and our thoughts can be directed through controlled information channels. And that's become very, very obvious.
When you say mimetic, you mean that we imitate what we see?
We are mimics. And safe and effective, weapons of mass destruction. These lines come again and again. And, I had some family over last year. It was like during election season, and I don't really care that much about politics, quite frankly, but it was the most important election of our lifetime, so I was paying attention. And a family member, I mentioned Robert Kennedy, and a family member was like, well, his own family hates him. And it was literally the day after the New York Times article about how his own family hates him. And I started asking some questions about Robert Kennedy. And of course, this family member, who I love dearly and who's incredibly smart, incredibly thoughtful and compassionate, knew nothing about the man other than yesterday's headline in the New York Times. And it's just that thing. You repeat something again and again, and it becomes embedded in something's consciousness.
Right.
So I think our rulers understand this very fundamental aspect of human psychology, and they've refined their methods accordingly. And given that we have these device, what started as the 24/7, cable series is now on-demand information whenever we want it. And we all sort of live in our own Plato's cave where we get the information catered to our predisposition, therefore reinforcing our own beliefs. Mm-hmm. So sorry, that's a mouthful.
So then go back to the network, and you talked about a dopamine loop. What are these things doing that's beyond ordinary propaganda? I think is where you were going.
I think they are. I think they are steering our general consciousness, and that chapter is like 15,000 words, and I won't get into all the detail of it. If anyone's interested, I encourage them to read the piece. But it's not entirely hopeless. And I then wrote part 4, which I called The Mirror.
Well, part 4, can you just give some examples? You've had successful exits in the tech space. You understand this technology. What is it doing that's more powerful or disruptive than looking at a phone book or reading a newspaper?
Well, let's give an example for something you wrote over the weekend. So you wrote what I thought was a fabulous piece about Casey Means.
Thank you.
And for anyone who hasn't read it, I strongly encourage you to read it. And without even taking a position on the particular appointment of Surgeon General, you're following the pattern recognition method. You're basically laying out a bunch of breadcrumbs and saying, well, this is interesting and that's interesting. And very specifically, and why I think this fits the network, is that Casey Means' company has a technology that, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, literally inserts a filament under your skin that transmits your internal biometric data to Google, SpaceX, and Twitter executives, right? So am I wrong about that?
That is the pitch. That's exactly what she's describing. Yes.
Right. So it's the exact technological evolution I describe in the network. Right. So it's perhaps influencing your mind and perhaps not, but it's certainly giving information about your body to technologists that could in turn influence your mind.
I was just going to say the feedback direction she describes is the impulses from your body get turned into electrical impulses that go to your phone, that go to the cloud. However, presumably the cloud could direct impulses through the filament into your body to affect your consciousness, to affect your body. I mean, if it's electrical impulses, all kinds of things can be done with that, right? You can impulses.
I don't know enough about this particular company. It could just be a data harvesting method. I mean, you said,
it's certainly, yeah.
Yeah, you said something like it's the most valuable tranche of unmonetized data in our world, which I thought was a really powerful line, and I underlined that one when I printed it out. So, it's this is it. I mean, this is the World Economic Forum called our bodies the final frontier, right? So this is data. I believe the war that we are in, whether it's I believe it's a spiritual war, but it's a political war, whatever the case may be. Ultimately, I really do believe it's a war for our cognitive sovereignty. It is a war for our free will, a war for our minds, and the force that we are up against, whatever they are, whoever they are, they understand this, and it's formidable, and it's obvious once you see it.
Right. Can I ask you a technical question, Josh, since you are a technologist? Sometimes when I'm looking at certain websites, especially if it has to do with biometric data harvesting, like upload your fingerprints or scan your, driver's license, I'll feel like I'm sensitive to electromagnetic fields anyway, and I'll feel like a big burst of quite toxic feeling energy coming from my phone. Is that something that is actually technically possible to change the amount of, I don't know, EMF coming from the phone, website to website?
So I will also say that if there are any of the, hundreds of software developers I've worked with through the years who are listening to this, they would laugh at you calling me a technologist, because I sort of sit at the cultural anthropological layer on top of the internet. So like product development and things like that, but I'm not a hardcore hardware guy.
You talk to technologists.
I know a few technologists. No, I think broadly, I think your intuition is right. EMF is powerful, right? So, my whole family now puts our phones in Faraday bags when we go to sleep at night.
Oh, that's
you and I have a mutual friend who no longer uses wireless at all. So it is really. So I think your intuition is sound in that it is the Wi-Fi that is part of the problem. So I think the thing is, turn off your Wi-Fi when you don't need it.
right.
And sadly, most of us are tethered to it and feel like we do need it. So it's never off.
Right.
But yeah, back to your piece, which again I thought was extraordinary, and I know your intention was not to write something related to what we're talking about today.
Well,
but
it's all
really,
right. So I mean, if you're right, it's all right.
That's right. But what you really hit on was the progression from external monitoring to internal biological surveillance, and it's perfectly embodied in levels.com. There's a quote that I use in the piece where Noah Harari, or whatever that maniac's name is, part of the WEF, talks about, the next phase is that we're hackable animals, and the next phase is, under the skin, and Levels does seem like it sort of fits that. And it fits Silicon Valley's interest in health data as part of this evolution that, I track through the patents, from monitoring your online behavior to actually monitoring your actual biology. Mm-hmm. And, the firmament or the filament under our skin today may be the precursor to the deeper neural integration tomorrow. And I think that's key, that these are not, there's no silver bullets with any of this stuff, right? A lot of it is really just about progression and where is the trend.
Right.
And the trend is very obvious. And I put an appendix in chapter 3, the network, which is really just a list of patents. And I tried to do my best of interpreting what the patents might be, or how they might be applied. And even if you're not interested in the piece, I encourage you to go check that out, especially people with children. Mm-hmm. Stuff like the Apple AirBuds, for example, there's some really, really sinister application with the AirBuds.
What?
They describe. Hang on, I don't want to misquote this. Let me pull up the exact quote. So there's an Apple patent, and I have the link to it, which it's for monitoring your brainwaves through AirPods. So that's not to say that Apple is using this today, and I don't believe they are. However, clearly someone at the Apple Corporation thinks that this is a really good idea.
Mhm.
And in fact, in the patent, documentation, it presents brain monitoring as a health feature while it's collecting your neural data.
Right. It's going to be that.
Yeah, so we're at the path where we've evolved from classified research to, oh yeah, this is great. This is for my health.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, 30 years ago, that would have seemed like science fiction. Oh, the CIA or, private industry wants to monitor your brainwaves with an entertainment device. But there it is. And I guess you and I would both say to our audiences that a patent doesn't mean that something exists, but it means that there is and time to figure out if it should exist, right? It's an area of interest.
That's exactly right. And I think that's really important. So a patent, again, I'm not claiming any smoking guns, but however, clearly some inventor or inventors at Apple presented this to someone in the corporation who thought this was a really good idea. And by the way, there might be really extraordinarily positive applications for technology like this. Right. There might be. And just like Neuralink, right? You hear Elon Musk present the benefits of Neuralink and they sound amazing. Mm-hmm. What are the trade-offs?
Right. Yeah. And always the issue of consent, right? I mean, and the issue of consent also has to do with understanding what you're consenting to. The website for levels.com doesn't say there'll be a needle in your body and it'll go to your phone and the data will go to the Google, SpaceX, and Twitter guys, in the cloud, and it can be sold forever to people you don't know, could be geolocated. Like it turns out you're walking out. It doesn't say that. So people could well read the website, which isn't really lying, and think, oh, great, a glucose monitor, I can lose 20 pounds. So the era we're in and heading into more and more is one in which people have to understand what's really being proposed for their brain waves and their bodies and coming out of their phones. By the way, another thing I've noticed, Brian loves a guy who has like sleep audio episodes. He's got a really hypnotic voice. And I listened to one of them for 5 minutes. And I'm like, honey, there's some bad, like subliminal messaging going on in that voice. And he couldn't hear it or it didn't bother him. But I just had this very deep intuition that something was wrong with this message. And I guess what I'm trying to say is studying the history of politics and movements and tyrannies for 1,000 years. The dream is to influence people's decisions without them knowing. So why wouldn't there be, back to the early 70s when everyone realized, oh God, it says SEX in the curls of Farrah Fawcett Major, and that's subliminal, or that book Subliminal Advertising, which probably you weren't even born when that came out. The subliminal is something that's always of advertising, and now technology. Right now.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I said it's a weird echo right now.
Got it.
But yeah, don't worry about it. Do you see what I mean? Like we could be being influenced continually, and I don't think there's any law saying that these developers or these companies need to disclose everything they're communicating to our brains or our subconscious. I'm just laughing because Brian O'Shea is on the chat saying, "You leave Glenn alone." Glenn is the name of his hypnotist sleep podcaster. But do you see what I mean, Josh? You could create an Airbnb type app that subliminally messages, behavior. You're just booking a lakeside vacation.
Yeah, I think it's called Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and Twitter or X or whatever the hell they call it. But some of this is old, particularly on the frequency stuff. And
it's not old to me and to a lot of us. What do you mean it's old on the frequency?
Well, I'm saying the notion is old. So, without going down the whole rabbit hole, like I touch on like the screaming women at Beatles concerts, for example, in the 60s. So there's
the scream.
There are theories about this, whether the frequency dials were dialed up or down, and Hitler's Nuremberg rallies. for example, were meticulously choreographed with the architecture, the lighting, the sound, all of it. And some believe that there was some frequency manipulation there too. Again, I didn't get into a lot of detail on this in the piece because it was a little more speculative. But one thing I did talk about that I opened the whole series with, and then I sort of closed with in the network part, was the Taylor Swift concert.
Please.
Yeah, so there was this this phenomenon. It was reported in the mainstream news that there were people, lots of young women who went to this Taylor Swift concert who reported getting amnesia. Mm-hmm. So they remembered going to the concert, they remembered going home, they didn't remember anything that happened there. And it happened across lots of different events, lots of different concerts in different cities. It's really, really weird. So, and it fits a lot of the mind control attributes, from dissociation, right? Induction. So there are pulsing lights and sound frequencies throughout the show that can create the same dissociative states that they use in MK Ultra. Memory compartmentalization. So again, there's fragmentation. So people forgot what happened at this. Post-hypnotic effects. So there are attendees remembered entering and leaving, and all these patterns matched one another, right? If it was like 3 or 4 people, but this was big enough that it was like covered in, BBC and ABC News and, kind of mainstream things. And, it's interesting to me, the most interesting part about it was how parents sort of laughed it off, right? Oh, my daughter was so smitten that she forgot the whole thing. I don't know. There's a neuroscientist named Michael Persinger, documents how very specific, he gets through his whole mechanism, which is a little sciencey and takes a little while to understand, but how electromagnetic frequencies can induce altered states of consciousness. This is not like crackpot theory. This goes through your frontal lobe and, alters your senses and can also, and if you deploy this at scale, meaning, thousands of people, this is not, I'm not saying that's what happened at this show. Right. However, it's super interesting that it happened, and it does make someone like me scratch your head and ask a lot of questions about why it happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. I mean, you're sparking so many thoughts. One of them is, what could possibly go wrong with 5,000 pubescent girls not being able to remember anything that happened to them for 2 hours, right? Number one. Number two, I'm flashing back to, again, the early hippie years when there were rock shows that involved psychedelic patterns and flashing lights. And that kind of art form also really came out of nowhere, and maybe that was inducing consciousness. Let's go back to what you said about, and I'm also, of course, thinking about, I think we talked about this, like my secret society show, where they did all the secret societies. I can't describe the details, but they did versions of Mithraic cult initiation where there's disorientation, you're blindfolded and noises and move from place to place. And so I think that technologies of altering consciousness have been around as long as there's been religion, right? But they're really more sophisticated with new technologies. But also I think that is what I wanted to say. Oh yes, what is it about rituals like the halftime concerts for the Super Bowl that do align our consciousnesses or make us suggestible? Like, what's happening? What's the mechanism of that?
Yeah, and I'm also not going to say I necessarily understand the mechanism, because I know I'm observing something. I know I'm observing something that that I always kind of absorbed, even from the time I was a child, but I didn't really understand what it was I was absorbing or why. So, I mentioned like the Paris Olympics, the Olympic ceremonies have always been wild. I embedded a bunch of video clips from the Olympic ceremony. The London 2012 had these hospital beds and dancing nurses with this NIH thing that it's just so weird, with like a viral cell, which made no sense in 2012. And then, if 8 years later, there's COVID, and makes one ask questions why this was some sort of ceremony. Um, it's with the risk of getting totally off topic. I do believe the world is run by occultists, right? So I think that if you look at the themes of some of these ceremonies, there's a massive Egyptian influence. There's a massive ancient influence through things that, growing up here in the West, I'm a New Yorker, right? So I went to public school. We didn't learn anything about these Egyptian symbols, which seem to be pervasive through all walks of our life. So is it possible that this ancient symbolism creates some resonance beyond our aware consciousness and is sort of activating something from within? Yeah, I think that's possible. But could I tell you definitively that's what's going on? No, I have no idea. And I don't think most of us do. There are people who very meticulously study this. And I've paid attention to it for the last couple of years, and it's utterly fascinating. I think in many ways, at the base level, right, it's like bread and circuses at scale, right? We're all being distracted by the performance and look at the shiny penny, and then there's something going on over there, right? Like starting a war that goes on for 20 years, or, destroying our economy, or whatever the case may be. But I do think there is something a bit more spiritual about all of this that goes beyond my understanding.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, both of us kind of lived, either in or at the kind of fringes of, I don't know what to say, like elite power structures. And I said in the past is that those people, don't spend time and effort on doing things that don't involve a return on investment of some kind. And the occultness that we're seeing, and I, like you, haven't wanted to see it, but once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? I've seen, Druidic themes in the coronation of the new king in Britain. I've seen, certainly the Super Bowl, and now there's all this satanic imagery all over, music that I wanted to disregard. Now I can't. But and the occultism of the Nazis is thoroughly documented. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if it didn't work, they wouldn't be doing it. If there wasn't something to it, they wouldn't be doing it.
So I think there's a few ways to look at it. That's certainly one, and I ascribe to your theory. Another is whether or not you think it works or not, they certainly believe it. Right. So whether or not this is total nonsense, I believe that the people who are choreographing these performances believe there's something to it.
Right.
This isn't limited. Like I could write a long thing about Hollywood.
Right.
Like the Oscar statue is the god of Ptah.
I saw that. Oh my God.
It's as ubiquitous as the air we breathe, right? The Baphomet symbol, which is like the goat head, the transgender god of, that's supposedly a satanic god of some sort. This is through all of our cultural iconography. So what does it mean is a bigger question. I think it's being revealed to us. I truly do.
By the bad guys, or by like the heavenly realms, the good guys?
I don't know. And this is a ongoing source of debate in my inner circle friend group. Sometimes you've gotten a little bit of a front row for that. And there's some belief that there's white hats and black hats and the good guys are winning. And then there's some belief that we're all just having our energy harvested and watching this show. And I think this is why, and just to get into part 4 a little bit, because I think it segues directly there. Mm-hmm. So in part 4, I talk about the mirror, which is essentially, look at the mirror as you wrote this piece about Casey Means, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you genuinely believe and made a pretty damn compelling case that there's something to look out for here, right? And again, maybe she'd make a fine surgeon general, maybe she's a really good actor, maybe she has the very best of intentions. Mm-hmm. But I think I look at that as sort of your part of your, and again, I know that's like one note on your very long awakening, but someone else might read that and that may be their mirror. So it's sort of like when.
What do you mean by that? I don't understand.
It's when they have what I call these pattern interrupts, right? Mm-hmm. So something happens in their life that presents them with, it's like a glitch in the matrix, like something presents them with this notion that something doesn't feel right. And I use pop culture references throughout to try to make it a little more accessible. And this one I use the Truman Show, which I think is the perfect analogy or the perfect storytelling vessel for the idea of the mirror. And Truman Show, for anyone who hasn't seen it, is this guy, everyone's seen the Truman Show. And if you haven't, you should. Yeah. It's really about liberation through recognition. Right. Mm-hmm. For some of us, that was COVID. For some of us, it was 9/11. For some of us, it was, the old timers. Some people knew that the official JFK story was bullshit, which, 60 years later, they're still talking about and finally maybe even admitting. Mm-hmm. So the very notion, the very word conspiracy theorist was created to, question those going after the JFK narrative. That was the official story in the Warren Commission. So, for me, part of this core insight, like I went through this notion of horror, right? How could this be true? And how could that be true? And what do you mean? And the world I lived in wasn't ever real. But, whereas I go through all the receipts in the first three parts, part 4 is a little more philosophical and it talks.
We have 6 minutes left. So you to have the time to talk about what you want to talk about in this episode. And then if we don't cover it, you'll have to come back for part 3.
That's up to you. I'd be shocked if you have me back.
Please keep going.
No, but I was just going to say, like, I think the fundamental questions that we're now wrestling with are free will. Mm-hmm. What is it? Do we really have it? Mm. Autonomy. And we talk a lot about bodily autonomy, particularly in the medical freedom movement, but we're talking about, autonomy of our minds, autonomy of our thoughts.
Yeah.
What it means to be human. Right. In an era where our thoughts can be technologically implanted or memories can be modified or perhaps even erased entirely. And the perceptual frameworks that shape our entire reality through these algorithms. I mean, these are kind of heavy concepts. Yeah. And I think they're worth fighting for the generations that come after us. Otherwise, my fear is and I don't think it has to be a mass awakening, right? Mm-hmm. Not everyone needs to look in the mirror. Most people won't. And I've seen you've tweeted about, and we've talked privately a bit about friends of yours and friends of mine who just have gone through weird patterns, friends in different walks that aren't friends with one another, that have had similar takeaways on similar issues, right? And very obviously being programmed by some force.
Right.
So the moment there's this crack of light, to me, that's utterly inspiring. And I think it just takes some minority of people that understand it well enough and get through the horror phase and ultimately become liberated.
Well, that's very hopeful. And I'm glad you said that. So I don't have to go take, belladonna or whatever, some horrible poison after our conversation. But how can I put this? What would be the goal? Say the world is run by occultists. At this point, I'm open to that possibility. Certainly being run by a small group of people who don't like humanity very much. What's their goal, and why would they bother with 400 years of recorded history that we can, I think, look back to, right? With records and artifacts, although you would argue not, perhaps. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, why do they bother with history? If they have the tools to just turn us into slaves or robots, why are we even having a semblance of the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the discovery of the poet, whatever, right?
You said something very subtle there that I'm sure most people didn't get, but you would argue not. So I do question most of our history, and I'll say that, and that's a longer conversation. We certainly have time for it. I don't know where we're headed. I do, again, I look at trends, and one of the trends that is undeniable is this notion of the programmable human.
Right.
And that, and it's, again, I wrote another piece called Node Without Our Consent, which was about 6G, right? Which was, I mentioned to you a couple of years ago, and I think you thought I was a lunatic, or was when you still thought I was a lunatic. And it's this notion that we are all going to be nodes in the next iteration of the internet.
Right.
And sure enough, more recently, CNBC and Popular Science magazine and mainstream publications are talking about how great this is. Oh, human beings are going to be antennas. Isn't that great? So if you think about it in a historical context, right? I think it was John D. Rockefeller famously said, we want a nation of workers, not thinkers.
Right.
So that's happening like Industrial Revolution time. You've got people on the assembly line in factories. Mm-hmm. So now with the proliferation of AI, we now live in a time where, well, wait a second, we actually don't need to be those kind of workers anymore. Maybe we just need energy. Maybe we're just energy harvesting machines. Right. I don't know. I don't pretend to have any answers. I have a slew of questions, though.
Yeah. Last question, I promise, and then I'll let you go. Sometimes I remember the world before 2020, and it felt completely different, and it felt much more material and three-dimensional. Could there have been some slippage in the fabric of reality in 2020 that has left us in another dimension, or have we unknowingly become part of some technological process of which we're unaware? Why does it feel so different pre and post 2020?
Just to land on a really simple question. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a metaphysical expert. So there's the thing, remember the Mayans said the world was going to end in 2012?
Yes.
Maybe it did.
I wonder.
Because I actually I think that's around the time it started feeling different. And I didn't realize it at the time, but right. Retrospectively, right. Everything started shifting. It was also not.
It's more theoretical now. I remember the world. Do you remember the world?
I do. I'm old enough to remember the world. And it's sort of funny. We're a few years apart, but if you're, between a little younger than me and a little older than you remember the world, but you're still young enough to navigate in the world we're in now.
Right.
And that's not the same for the youngsters, right?
Right.
The millennials don't remember. This is one of the reasons, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but this is one of the reasons why, I think the transgender thing is so strange to us, mm-hmm. and really is, and the inverse of that to young people. Mm-hmm. To us, it's so strange, mm-hmm. that my heart goes out to someone who's born with gender dysphoria, and it's a real thing, and all the disclaimers. But it's bizarre to me that there is a group of people that think it's okay for men to dominate women's sports, right?
Yeah.
And if you're below a certain age, you're like, oh no, you're a bigot if you think that, because right. they don't remember before.
Oh my God, Josh, as always, I could talk to you for another 3 hours. You'll have to come back next week if you have time because I know people want to hear more, and they want to hear about part 4 and finish whatever we didn't finish in part 3. But where do people find you in the meantime?
My Substack is Stylman, stylman.substack.com. I'm on Twitter, Stylman, and I'm on Instagram, where I mostly just post stories at Stylman. And I hide out in the woods in the Hudson Valley and talk to the trees.
And is there a final thing you think people should do between now and the time they hear from you again to not despair? I mean, I know you sort of said don't despair, but
no one's ever gonna hear from me again after this. I'm just joking. I think the key is we all need to just pay attention, and maybe when we hear something in the news that is maybe a little bit triggering, to use the vernacular of our times, maybe think twice about it and say, do I take this at face value, or is this about incitement? And is somebody trying to get me to have a particular point of view that may in fact put me at odds with someone in my family or a neighbor? And, to take some of the positive spirit of the time you were talking about earlier from your childhood, I think maybe we all need to be a little kinder to each other. And maybe we realize that we're all being manipulated and we have a common enemy that's trying to make us hate each other, which is certainly my hypothesis.
Well said. We can't wait to hear more. Thank you for spending time with us, everyone. This has been Josh Stylman. You've got to follow his Substack, and I'm sure you're going to hear from him again as soon as we can get him back on his calendar in the weeks ahead. And thank you so much for being with us, Josh.
Thank you, Naomi. It means a lot.
Okay.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.